mother leaves her child in an abandoned house. 10 years later, she returns and can't believe her eyes. The rain pounded mercilessly against the decaying house while the wind rattled the old shutters. Inside, a woman stood, her clothes soaked, her hands trembling as she looked at her little son. Luis sat on the cold floor, his large brown eyes filled with innocence and confusion. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the storm. But she turned away before tears could blur her vision. A final glance might have stopped her, but she had already made her decision. The door clicked shut behind her. Outside, the wind howled, as if it were screaming out her betrayal. Luis didn't understand that he had just been abandoned. But as he stood up to run after his mother, something soft clung to his arm, the dog she had left behind as well. The animal, thin and scruffy, stared into his eyes, as if it knew what had happened. When Luis reached for the door, the dog began to growl, not out of anger, but out of fear. It was as if he was saying, "Stay here. I'm still here." The boy stumbled back, crawled into the corner of the room, and hugged his knees to his chest. Darkness crept through the cracks of the house, but the dog lay beside him and gently licked his hand. They were alone, but not apart. Days passed. Hunger tormented Luis, but each time he woke up something edible lay beside him. A half-eaten apple, a stale crust of bread, sometimes even a chicken bone with a bit of meat left on it. The dog disappeared at night and returned with food, scavenging from garbage bins or open backyards. Luis began to follow his animal rescuer. He learned to hide, move through the darkness, and find just enough to survive, just like the dog. No one in the village suspected that in the ruins of an abandoned house, a boy lived with a dog, and that the animal protected him as if he were its own pup. Luis was now 7 years old, a child who had never gone to school, yet had mastered survival like an adult. He could move silently through the streets, knew every hidden trash bin, and was well aware of when the bakers threw out their leftovers. But he was never alone. His dog was always by his side, a shadow, a protector. The villagers had occasionally seen a boy darting through the narrow alleys, but they had never looked closely. Luis did not exist in their world. Until the day a woman with dark, thoughtful eyes stopped in front of the ruins of the house. Sophia had not come out of curiosity. She had returned to the place of her childhood on a strange impulse. For years she had avoided the past, but now, standing before the crumbling house, she felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She was about to leave when something moved. A boy with messy hair, dirty clothes, and a wary gaze peeked out from the window. She froze. Luis. Her heart pounded as she realized that this half-wild child was her nephew, the son of her sister, who had abandoned him years ago. Stunned, she knelt and reached out her hand, but Luis flinched away. He knew no affection, only the dog, who stepped protectively in front of him. Sophia needed time to earn his trust, but eventually she took Luis with her, into a world he had never known. For the first time, he slept in a bed, wore clean clothes, and never went hungry. But the greatest surprise came at school. Luis was a natural talent. He devoured knowledge, solved problems effortlessly, and exceeded all expectations. By the age of 12, he was the top student in his class. The abandoned child had become a prodigy. Luis was now 13 years old, a remarkable boy who understood the world around him faster than others, yet carried an emptiness in his heart that he couldn't name. He knew he was different, that his past had shaped him. But on what seemed like an ordinary day, as he returned home from school, someone was waiting for him, a man with deep, serious eyes and a presence that could not be ignored. Sophia stood beside him, uncertain, her hands clasped together. "Luis, this is your father." The words echoed in his mind. He had never asked about him, had never imagined that one day he would stand before him. The man, David, had only recently learned that he had a son. When he was told what Luis had been through, 5 years in an abandoned house with nothing but a dog by his side, he could hardly believe it. His own son had survived like an animal, had grown into a genius and now stood before him as an almost adult. David didn't know what he had expected, but he hadn't imagined facing a boy with so much strength, yet so much distance in his eyes. He wanted to be there for him, but could a man who had never been a father simply step into his life? Yet fate had another twist in store. As David and Luis slowly got to know each other, an old, forgotten story came back to life. Sophia and David had once loved each other as children, before Luis's mother had come between them, before she had claimed David for herself. And now they stood before each other once again, not as children, but as adults who still understood each other, who still felt the same connection. As they cared for Luis together, as David slowly became part of his life, the inevitable happened. Sophia and David fell in love again. But what would happen when the past caught up with them? When the woman who once destroyed everything suddenly? Years had passed and Luis, the abandoned boy, had grown into a young man. He had everything that had once been denied to him: a family, security, love. Sophia and David had married, given him 2 siblings, and the house where he had once been left behind had become a warm, lively home. The crumbling ruins were gone. In their place stood a beautifully renovated house filled with laughter and life. Luis was no longer the wild child lurking in the shadows of the village. He was a fighter, a winner, someone who had pulled himself out of the darkness. But one day, a stranger stood at the gate, the woman who had once abandoned him. His biological mother had never expected to return here, but driven by guilt and curiosity, she wanted to know what had become of the child she had left behind. As she stood before the house, her breath caught. A well-kept garden, children's laughter coming from inside. And then she saw her sister Sophia, radiant and happy beside the man she had once loved. Her heart tightened as she realized that not only had Luis moved on without her, David and Sophia had built a family she would never be part of. Then Luis stepped out of the house, tall, confident, carrying himself like a man who had won, not a child lost to fate. He looked at her, and in his gaze there was none of what she had feared. No longing, no sorrow, no open wounds. He was not her son anymore. He belonged to the family that had truly loved him. And in that moment she understood. She had lost him, not just to life, but to the people who had made him strong. She had left him behind, and fate had decided that she would never be part of his life again. Fate often takes unexpected paths. To be abandoned is painful, but it does not have to be the end. Luis had been left behind, yet he had risen above his past and found love where he had never expected it. But truth also requires courage. Admitting mistakes is hard, but it is the first step to letting go. His mother realized that she had lost him, not just as a son, but as a part of his life. And so, one final lesson remains. Sometimes, true love is not in holding on, but in letting go. Did you enjoy this story? Don't forget